Almost. There we go. Good evening. Appreciate the presence of each one. We have a good number of attendants. We want to welcome everybody to our midweek study. For those who are at home joining, I want to welcome you as well. And hopefully everyone does have the material by now, especially since I'm not planning to really use it at all tonight. But I will use the title and basically a few other points from it. I got a lot out of this study on complaining. And, I've never complained before, so, this is something new for me. But I think it's one that really goes to the heart of what some of our issues are about when it comes to complaining. And all these that we've been looking at and will continue to look at are tied into having the proper self-image and understand what it means to be made in the image of God, and how understanding being made in the image of God can help us avoid things like complaining. But also I want us to spend some time tonight, and it's my plan to spend time tonight and talking about, is it always wrong to complain? And what's the difference between things like complaining and things like murmuring and grumbling, lamenting, groaning, those types of things. So I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about that tonight as well. Before we get started, I've asked Matt if he would lead us in a word of prayer.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for allowing us this time to get together again tonight, to be one with you, to be able to study your word. Father, tonight as we take a look at studying your image and specifically looking into the aspects of complaining, we pray that we are able to keep that out of our lives, to truly think about and dwell upon all that you bless us with, and just how lucky we are to have you in our lives, to have your church in our lives. Father, we pray that we are always positive and always looking forward, pressing to you. Please be with Eddie as he directs us in the study. Help us to all be attentive and taking the things we hear and applying. Father, please forgive us all of our sins and help us to have a safe trip home. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you. How many of you did the bracelet deal with the complaining? You're supposed to swap the wrist if you said a complaint. How'd that go? I heard a lot of, okay, but was that really a complaint? When somebody said something about swapping wrists and things, and but y'all didn't have to pop yourself with it, right? Like hurt yourself first before you did it? And sometimes I think that's the way that we think about trying to get out of certain bad habits, is maybe we have to have a reminder like that, which I think can be good. Sometimes there may be some pain involved, self-inflicted pain, to try to help you remember about things. One of the quotes that was there in the study was this: the next time you feel like complaining, remember that your garbage disposal probably eats better than 30% of the world's population. I'm like, wow, I don't think I want to read the rest of the study after that, because it is so easy. And I appreciate what Matt prayed a few moments ago. It is real easy to forget how blessed we are and begin to complain about things. And so one of the ways in which a poor self-image is manifested is by this idea of constantly murmuring and complaining and arguing. And we're going to define those terms in a moment. It's also, and I thought this was a really good point that the author made, is that our brains are like a painter, that whatever image you want to give, that you give to your brain's going to complete that image. It's going to paint that picture. And so if you have a negative self-image, you look at yourself in a negative way, if you look at yourself in a way that's much more exalted than you ought to be, your brain is going to paint an image of that. It becomes your self-image. If you've ever watched that show The Matrix, or the movie The Matrix, he had his real life, but then he had his personification of who he was as a character. And that's sort of what happens with us, is we paint a picture of ourselves, and then we begin living up to whatever that image is, whether it's too lowly or too highly exalted. And so if I want to quit complaining, I need to make sure that I stop, as Matt prayed about, thinking so negatively. And we do live in a society that's full of negativity. Just think that if you eliminated all of the negative talk that you had today, would that have greatly decreased the amount of talking you did today? Or would it be something where you wouldn't have noticed it at all? And I think for a lot of people, it seems that unless we're complaining about something, we really don't have anything to talk about, it seems. And that can really damage our influence as Christians, and it affects us in a bad way. Philippians 2. Let's read Philippians 2. If somebody read verses 14 through 18.
Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may have cause to glory, because I did not run in vain or toil in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. And you too, I urge, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me.
All right, so let's get the context of this letter. Where's Paul at? He's in prison. Does he know whether he's going to live or die? No. He even says in this context that if I'm being poured out as a drink offering, right? So he doesn't know whether he's going to live or die. He's confident he's going to live, but he's not certain of that very thing. The congregation he's writing to has given him a lot of joy, but they are also under persecution. He says in the first chapter, in verses 27 through 30, that there's a conflict that's existing among them, just as Paul himself was persecuted. In beginning of chapter 4, you see that there's two ladies in the congregation that are at odds with one another, arguing with each other. And it may be that they're actually pulling others to encamp on their sides with whatever this argument is that's going on. But they're definitely not of the same mind. And in the midst of that, Paul says that we're supposed to be able to do, and they're supposed to be able to do all things without, New King James uses complaining and disputing. So, first question, how many things can be done without complaining and arguing about it? All things. Everything. Do you believe that statement? Can you honestly say that you believe that everything can be done without grumbling, murmuring, complaining, and arguing about it? How many of you are married? Right? You know there's things that we face on a daily basis that challenge us, that make it very, very difficult. But Paul says that this is a thing that's a necessity. This is what you can do. Do everything. It's not a suggestion, and it's not something that you ought to aspire to. It's a commandment. Do all things. Paul says without these two horrible characteristics of murmuring and arguing about it. Then the benefits in verse 15, the first one, you become blameless. Does that mean perfect? What does blameless mean? What does it mean to be blameless? It's not perfection.
In one sense, it kind of just means forgiven.
Right. The parents of John the Baptist, it says of them that they were blameless. You know, these were people that if you make a mistake, you correct it. You've been forgiven. Right? There's no one who can bring a charge against you about anything. So murmuring and disputing is a way in which people can bring a charge against you. But here you cannot. You become harmless. People who are not hurting others. That word for disputing, some of your versions may even have the word arguing there because that's what it means. You are recognized as being children of God who are without fault. And it makes you stand out in the midst of a generation that's crooked and perverse. That's the way in which we shine as lights, is by not murmuring and arguing about things. We're able to hold fast to the word of life as a valuable thing. And really, that's the thing that's going to keep us, as we go into the study, from murmuring and disputing. And this is also something that we're supposed to be able to share with other people, too. Paul talks so much about the joy he had with the brethren there, but he also wanted the brethren to share in his joy also. But he wanted them to be able to know that they're not running or laboring in vain. This is how important these ideas are, and why we need to understand exactly what we're talking about. So, murmur. What does the word murmur mean?
Grumbling.
Say it again.
Grumbling.
Grumbling. Okay, grumbling is going to be another word we're going to use also. It is very similar, though. Yes, ma'am.
I would think it's whispering below your breath where everyone else can hear you, and you just have a bad attitude toward everything. You're not going to agree with anything because you've already got your mindset.
Right. When you look at the literal definition, it's a low or indistinct sound or speech. This is what we do behind people's backs. That's what happens. That's the whispering. That's the murmuring. The way to remember what the definition of murmur is just by listening to how you sound when you say it. You murmur. And that's what it sounds like. And when you know people are whispering and saying things, but you don't really know what they're saying. But something's going on. And a lot of times you can tell that between brethren.
But it's with the intent of complaining behind somebody's back or talking bad about them or not liking the situation or whatever. It's intentionally with that context in mind.
A lot of times it is. When you think about just the word murmur itself, though, when Jesus showed up at one of the feasts, the people whispered to one another, or they spoke to themselves or amongst themselves, saying, "What do you think about him?" And it wasn't necessarily that they were complaining about him, even though it's translated complaining in some versions, but they were whispering to one another because they were afraid of being heard by others. And so there's a context in which the idea or principle is fine, but this is used negatively throughout the scriptures to talk about what we're discussing.
Like you said, if you speak up and you speak loud, then you're wanting to be heard and understood.
Mm-hmm.
But by remembering, it's like an undercover thing. As Jesus said, all bad things happen in darkness, not in the light. So what you're basically doing is putting yourself in the darkness when you know.
You are, right. Now, a step up from that would be the idea of grumbling. The word grumbling means a low thundering, a rumbling, or growling sound. This is the sound your stomach makes when it's hungry. And this is what we mean when we talk about people are grumbling. They sound like a bunch of hungry stomachs, that they're baring their teeth at one another. This is when we get face to face with someone else, and that's when we're arguing with someone else. Another word is the word complain, and complain can be a synonym of grumbling. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. There's several different words, Greek words that are used, and many of them are interchangeable, especially between grumble and complain. But when complain is being used as a verb, that's when it makes it a lot different than a grumble. Used as a verb, it means to express feelings of pain, dissatisfaction, or resentment. Okay, so when you're thinking about a complaint or complaining about something, that's what we're talking about. Just to make sure we understand what that looks like, this is what it looks like. It's the kid that's got a plate full of food, but none of it's what he wants. And you know what's going to happen. It's like if you were to ask me if I want meatloaf and okra. No, I don't. But it may be delicious to a lot of other people. That's why a lot of people right now are looking very confused. However, I don't like it. I don't want it, right? And that's what happens, is that we don't appreciate the fact that maybe someone made it, that was special to them, that was their mother's recipe, whatever else it is. But the person who's receiving it does not receive it well. And so with this, it's a very immature thing when we think about murmuring and complaining and disputing. Brandon?
Do you think there's a context, question earlier, do you think there's a context or a method of complaining that is not inappropriate?
Yes. And so what we're going to do, and that's where I want us to spend some time talking about, is that there is and we're going to try to make sure we make a distinction between sinful complaining and complaining that maybe needs to be done about something, or a complaint that needs to be made about something. Matthew 18, if you have something against your brother, what are you supposed to do? All right, so when you go to your brother and you say that this is what you've done to transgress, is that a complaint?
You might say so.
Yeah, you did what was wrong, and you did it against me. If I go and I take a couple more witnesses with me, have I complained to others about this brother? But have I murmured? Have I grumbled? That's where we need to be sure that we're making a distinction. I want us to look at a few passages. Psalm 40, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of passages we could look at, especially in the Psalms. Somebody read Psalm 44, 23 through 26.
Arouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? For our soul has sunk down into the dust. Our body cleaves to the earth. Rise up, be our help, and redeem us for the sake of your loving kindness.
All right, if you were to back up anywhere within this particular psalm and start looking at some of the things that he's talking about, this is one of those psalms that we call a psalm of lamenting. And he is constantly talking about how it is that you've abandoned us. Verse 9, you've cast us off, you've put us to shame. You do not go out with our armies. You make us turn our back from our enemies. Those who hate us have taken us as spoil for themselves. You've given us up like sheep intended for food. You've scattered us among the nations. Verse 22 is actually a passage that we know well because it's repeated in a passage that's very victorious. Verse 22, yet for your sake we are killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Paul uses that in Romans chapter 8. That talks about victory. However, here the psalmist is saying that this is what's happening. We're counted as sheep for the slaughter. Is he complaining about their situation? So why do we call it a lamentation then and not a complaint? Is it word gymnastics just so that we can excuse one and condemn the other? What's different about this than a person who's just murmuring or complaining? Go ahead, man. Since you asked the question, please answer it. All right.
So I think there's a couple things that go into it because, being married is something we talk about. I'm just, observing things.
I'm just praying.
But and like as a nurse, right? Like part of the thing I do is like, what is your chief complaint?
Right.
Right. Like, so I'm asking people all day long, like, what do you have that you don't want or don't like?
Right.
But I think part of it, when we're talking here, is there are things that can be done that are wrong to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I can do a Matthew thing about it. But how easily am I offended? How easily am I wronged? How easily am I transgressed?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think that's where we find our spectrum of complaint.
Yeah, and I like it that you use a medical analogy too, because a doctor, the first oath they take is to do no harm. Now, they do a lot of things to try to help. And those things that they do to try to help, they may end up causing harm. However, they're trying to help. And above everything else, they're said, you may not be successful, the person may die, that there's a lot of things that could go wrong. However, do no harm. And when we're thinking about a complaint, there are times and situations where we need to say something about something that is not right. And it may be that there's something in my life that is not right. When you go through the prophets, over and over and over again, the prophets enumerate all these different things that are happening to the people. What is different when you go through prophecies and these psalms of lament is about they always end with the same idea. What's going to save me from this? My complaint's not going to. And my complaint's directed toward the right person. And my complaint can only be fixed by, as he says here, awake, arise. He doesn't want him to hide his face from him any longer. It's about God's deliverance. That's the difference. The complainer is satisfied with being lazy and only complaining about the issue and not doing anything to make it better. Glenn?
In verse 26, it's saying that we're looking unto God, our unfailing love.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing when we go to someone for help, we go with the hope that they can help us.
Right.
From the person that we go to. And of course, God is the one who's our greatest help.
Absolutely. Let's go to John 11. John 11, and somebody read verse 38.
Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it.
All right, this is at the grave of Lazarus, and the people are wondering if Jesus is the Son of God. They still don't understand it, and they're like, this guy did all these other things. Surely if he had been here, this wouldn't have happened. Why? And Jesus is understandably upset by that, and he groans within himself. So we know Jesus didn't sin, but he did groan within himself about what was seen. So we need to understand, I was talking about this in the lesson Sunday, we we're not supposed to pretend that bad things are good. We're not supposed to make situations up within our minds. You know, our culture right now is in this habit of taking things that are, yes, bad, but they have to paint them in an even worse picture to make people hate it more. You don't have to do that with the truth. And when we paint a different picture than what reality demands, we're murmuring and we're complaining. The word that we often use that we know from that picture with that child a moment ago, when our child does that, we say our kid is whining. And that's what we're talking about. When murmuring and grumbling and complaining is nothing more than whining, that's when it's ungodly. When we're pointing out something that needs to be changed and we're trying our best to do something about it by going to the right source to do something about it, then it's all right. Gary?
Yeah, just even in our everyday language, you think about it, there's a difference in a complaint and a complainer.
Right.
So I may have a complaint, like you said, a feeling of pain or dissatisfaction, but when we get to the murmuring or the complaining, if we're honest with ourselves, we're not seeking resolution to that.
Right.
We're just seeking to stir up discord because we didn't get our way. We're trying to pit one person against another, trying to hurt someone with that. So our intent is not to resolve it, it's just to cause discord.
Yeah, it is, and we're going to notice that very thing in a few moments. And that's why whenever these feelings come, we have to acknowledge that they're there. In Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25, we're not going to have time to read this, but in that verse, those verses, it talks about us as Christians groaning. We're like the earth that's wanting to be delivered from this body that we're in, and that's what's groaning within us as well. But in Romans chapter 8, that groaning within us is associated with the idea of hope, that we know that this isn't going to last forever. This suffering that is but for a moment is working for us something that's far exceeding better. It's not worthy to be compared with what's yet to be revealed. And so the Apostle Paul tells the Roman brethren to not be upset about these things overly, because you will be delivered from them. Right now you're groaning within yourself, but deliverance is coming. So hold on to that hope that you have. In Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, there is a complaint that is made. And it's made by members of the church against some other members of the church. What was that complaint? Yeah. Was that a justifiable complaint? Is that something that needed to be taken care of? Brandon?
I think you look in Exodus too, right? Like the Jews were complaining.
We're going to go through a lot of those in a few moments. Yeah. Absolutely. And so there's a lot of things that even though they're realistic, we have to still handle them correctly so that we don't become, like Gary said a moment ago, complainers about the complaint that we have. John?
I think the difference in Acts 6 and what was brought up about the Jews in Exodus is that a solution was presented and the solution fixed the problem.
Right.
In Exodus, the solution did not fix the problem, it just kept on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the big difference.
Yeah, and the problem, though, really was with the individuals themselves. This is what happens a lot of times. We'll go into more detail about it. This is what happens a lot of times is that we get upset about something, we complain about it to someone else who is not able to do anything about the problem. And that murmuring and complaining, as was said a few moments ago, is something that sows discord. It sows distrust. The reason it's done is so that others may become sympathetic to your position, to where you're at, so that you can build allies, so that when you get the answer that you probably already know is not going to go in your favor, others will feel sympathetic towards you and can be those miserable comforters that are by your side as you mourn and lament and whine about having to eat your vegetables because your mom has 2 rules: eat it or go hungry. And that's how we feel about life oftentimes. And because of that, we murmur and complain, and we never actually do anything about it. But what we're looking at tonight is that we need to understand that it is possible to lament without grumbling, and it is possible to groan without murmuring, and it is possible to complain without arguing, because there you have sort of the opposite of some of these things. Yes, ma'am?
Is it murmuring, grumbling, kind of like a reflection of selfishness?
It is. Yes, very much is. It's a prideful thing. It's a selfish thing. More than anything else, and this is what I would challenge you to really meditate on. More than anything else, it's a knowledge issue. And that's where I think sometimes we miss the boat. because it is about selfishness, it is about pride, it is about a graciousness or lack of thankfulness, but more than anything else, it's about lack of knowledge. It's a lack of understanding, proper understanding. So let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and in verses 6 through 11, Paul is going to say this. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 through 11. In verse 6, he talks about, now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And he talks about how the Israelites were going through the desert in their wanderings and all these different things they fell prey and victim to. Then in verse 10 it says, nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. And that's many occasions where we see that happening. Verse 11, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So along with all these other things that Paul enumerates, he also talks about this complaining that they did. So let's notice a few of them. Exodus chapter 15. And these are some of the things that usually cause us to get into a complaining mode. Exodus chapter 15. And somebody read verses 22 through 26.
Then Moses led Israel on from the Red Sea, and they went out to the wilderness of Shur. They journeyed for 3 days in the wilderness without finding water. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water at Marah because it was bitter. That's why its name was Marah. The people grumbled to Moses, "What are we doing, or what are we going to drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he threw it in the water became drinkable. He made a statute and ordinance for them at Marah, and he tested them there. He said, "If you will carefully obey the Lord your God, do what is right in his eyes, pay attention to his commands, and keep all his statutes, I will not inflict any illness on you. I inflicted on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you."
All right, Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals you, right? And when you go through that, he talks about these waters called Marah. Who changed her name to Marah? Right, because she had lost her husband and her sons, right? And so she said, don't call me by my own name. Call me Marah. She wanted to be called that, but no one else did, and God never called her that. And again, these people, when they came out of Egypt, they have their wives and their children with them. And they're thirsty. Many occasions they're hungry. They're tired. Is it a legit thing to say, I don't know where my family's going to get their next meal? What did they not understand about this situation? What was God doing with this? At the end of verse 25, he was testing them. So was it good for them, needed for them to go through this? Yes. The place where they were at, the wilderness of Shur, S-H-U-R, that name means wall. They literally hit the wall. That's when you know what you're made of. It means nothing to say we believe something when it hasn't been tested. It's only when our beliefs have been tested that we can really say that we believe something. Brandon, then Oren.
So earlier in Exodus, right, like they were complaining about the slavery that they were under,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like that was a just complaint,
Right.
Because there was, injustice happening.
Right.
But here, this was ungratefulness.
Right.
And distrust of God, right? And I think that for me, like that's a good barometer for me. Am I being ungrateful, or is there like an injustice or like something else?
Right. Somebody read Psalm 106. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Oren. And then somebody read Psalm 106, 24 and 25.
This kind of feeds into picking up in those verses, and it goes along with a little bit of what you're talking about, what Brandon was talking about, especially hitting that wall. There's a footnote on grumbled in Exodus that leads to Psalm 106, verse 13, that says they quickly forgot his works. They did not wait for his counsel.
Right.
So when push came to shove, and they're just, well, what are we going to do now?
Right.
We can't do anything. And so we pick up those
Same
verses.
thing. So, and in that same psalm as well. Psalm 106, 24 and 25. Somebody read that.
Then they despised the pleasant land. They did not believe in his word, but grumbled in their tents. They did not listen to the voice of the Lord.
All right, now this is one of the things that you see many times. They grumbled or they murmured, and where did they do it? In their tents. But where did God see them doing it? In their tents. He saw what was happening. He saw what was going on, and he understood what was happening with his people, and that his people did not believe. The way in which you bring that to the surface is by testing. Right? Remember when I was talking about testing a few weeks ago, when Jesus was really kind of testing his apostles when he put them out on the water. You know, when the teacher is teaching, that's when she answers your questions. But when she puts the test in front of you, that's when you answer hers. And when God tests us, you know, we can go through this period here. This is where we're answering questions or asking questions and getting answers. But when testing comes, that's when you have to give the answer. Do you believe or not? Matthias?
To continue that thought and then Oran's thought, in verse 14 and 15, they were complaining because they had wine cravings. Nothing legitimate, they just wanted to complain because they didn't, something didn't taste right. Like, you go to a restaurant and you get your food. I ordered a medium rare steak. It came out slightly more medium than I wanted it to.
Right.
Dangerous things for a restaurant. And it's saying they tested God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, God's there to test them, and they want to test God and see what they can get out of him now.
Right. I've heard the expression before that when you're in deep water, that's the best time to keep your mouth shut. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. You know, that when we're going through hard and difficult times, that's when it's easiest to say things that we should not say and to think things that we should not be thinking. And often we may do this and think no one else sees it, no one else hears it, but God does. And what we also have to understand is that when we do that, the one we're complaining against is God. Mike?
Wouldn't the same thing hold true that, let's say in a doctrinal discussion, that I might hold a different view to something that no one else would hold, but I held it privately and didn't, want to share it, as it were. But it's still your obligation or anybody else's obligation to try to teach me the truth on the matter, where it would become a false doctrine issue. But if I didn't speak it to anyone, it's just like as if I did it in my tent.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, if we're not, there are things that we all have to work out. And even like with this, I mean, you don't just stop complaining overnight. It's a thing we have to work out. And we'll get to that too if we have time tonight as well. Another time that they complain is when they start looking back. And this happens a lot as well. It's easy for us to look back and say, well, it was so much better when I was a kid. It was so much better when I was a teenager. It was so much better, at the end of 2019, we could say it was a whole lot better when this person or that person was in office. We could say a lot of those things. That's when we start, that's really complaining, and it is murmuring and grumbling if we're not careful. And this is what happened with them as well. In Exodus 16, verses 2 through 8, this is where the bread's coming down from heaven in those verses. And they begin in verse 3 to say, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt." Because where were they sitting? Yeah, they were sitting by the pot of meat. All they had to do was just reach over and grab the food. They had it anytime they wanted to. And they were complaining about that bread that God was going to be giving them. When we complain about how things used to be, it causes us, as it says in Luke 9, verse 62, no one having put his hand to the plow and looking back is worthy. Because when you follow the Lord, there's going to be some times that are hard and difficult. He's going to put you through times of testing. Being a Christian is risky because everything is at risk. I think sometimes we forget that because of how easy we got it here. But everything you have is at risk as a Christian. Your livelihood's at risk. Your life is at risk. Your whole family turning against you is at risk. Everything is at risk when you're a Christian because you have renounced all of those things for Christ. And anyone who puts his hand to the plow and wants to look back is not fit. And that's what Jesus tells those who would be his disciples on many different occasions. And what this really is as we talked about Sunday morning, is not understanding what contentment really is. That when we think about what Paul said in 1 Timothy 6, 7, and 8, in our memory verse for this month, that, verse 6, Godliness with contentment is great gain. We brought nothing into the world, we can't take anything out. What that means is, besides food and clothing, or food and shelter, everything else is a want, not a need. Everything else. Your food and something to cover you, that's it. Everything else is a want, not a need. And because of that, no matter what situation you are in, you can find contentment because you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. Whatever it is that God needs you to do, you're going to be able to accomplish because God's the one who's the supplier. That's what we mean by that contentment that we looked at. And so when we have a misconception of what it means between a want and a need, it makes us complain. In this particular instance, food was not something that they did not want what it was that God was going to provide. They wanted something else entirely, which leads us to another thing. When we don't get what it is that we want. Now, this is where it gets very precarious for us. Numbers chapter 11. Numbers 11. I'm not going to read all 9 of those verses, but notice that in Numbers 11, 1 through 9, that the people are complaining again. It displeases the Lord. He hears it. And fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some who were where? Outskirts of the camp. You ever wondered why it was the outskirts? The complaining, the ones who get burned up are the ones who are doing the complaining, right? And they're on the outskirts. Why do you think they would be complaining? Who's in the most dangerous position? The ones on the outskirts. Who are the ones who probably don't feel as important as someone else? The ones on the outskirts. Who does it take the longest to get word to get provisions? The outskirts. Who feels like they're not being done right? The outskirts. Who's complaining and gets consumed by fire? The outskirts. We have to be careful when we don't get what it is that we want. We have mistaken concepts about so many different things because we forget who we are. We're not talking about who people in the world are. We're talking about who we are. We are children of God, harmless and blameless in the midst of a world that does not appreciate that. And we shine as lights. We hold fast to that word. And the way that we do that most often is by not complaining and by not arguing and fighting about things. Where did I see that hand? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Scripture says that we don't belong to ourselves, we belong to the Lord.
Right.
So if we belong to Him, what is the complaint? Is it against Him?
Yeah. It absolutely is always against Him, ultimately. If you look at Numbers chapter 21, and this is how ridiculous it gets. This is how we need to you've heard of lying to yourself, self-deception, and how bad self-deception can actually be. I mean, it can get completely ridiculous how self-deceived we are. In Numbers chapter 21, verses 4 and following, notice what it says. It says, "Then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. The soul of the people became very discouraged." That means that it came very short. They lost their patience on the way. "And the people spoke against God and against Moses. 'Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water." And notice after the comma, "and our soul loathes this" what? Food. Right? This worthless bread. There is no food or water, and we are tired of this food. Which is it? When you see some of the things that go on, I mean, you hear it, and it's like, do you not just hear what you said? Brandon?
It's the teenager who opens the fridge and says, "Mom, there's nothing to eat," and it's full of food.
Right.
It's not what I want.
It's not what I want. Exactly. And that's what we're talking about. You know, at the end of the day in Matthew 20, you know, you had these people who had worked all day long. And then you had some who only worked that last hour. And the ones who worked all day long were the last in line to receive their wages at that. And when they got to the front of the line, they thought they were going to get a whole lot more, because after all, don't we deserve a whole lot more than them because of all this extra work we did and how long we've labored and how much work we put in? And what happened to them? They got what they agreed to. Right. This is what you agreed to. You brought nothing into this world, and you'll take nothing out. That's just by being a human being. You brought nothing in the world, you take nothing out. That's the price of humanity. That's what you've agreed to by living. Okay? As a Christian, we know that there's something more that's waiting for us. But do we have more in this life than someone else, really? We brought nothing in, we take nothing out. It's the same thing. But the perspective is different about this. What this does is it causes us to forget about who it is that's actually in that leadership role. And that's what they did in Numbers chapter 12. If you back up to Numbers chapter 12, and this happens again over in chapter 16, they complain about Moses being the leader. And they say, you're taking too much. Anybody could do this. All of God's people are holy. Why should you be making this decision? But who were they actually complaining about? God. This is a harsh lesson. When you complain about God's leadership, who are you complaining about? Now, in the church today, who is that leadership? And too often it's the case where you have people who murmur and complain because I wanted the elders to do this, and they did not do it. And that murmuring and complaining should not be directed toward the eldership. Directed to the person that you actually are complaining about. Take that complaint, take that murmur, and you direct it toward God. Turn it into lamentation. God, I need help. This is what I'm feeling. This is what's going through my mind, and I'm misdirecting it. I'm turning it on my brethren. I'm turning it on your leadership. I'm doing it wrong, and I need you to help me. God can handle it. He can handle it. This is the question, though, can you? Because it's not enough for us to say, I'm a kind of person who does murmur and complain a lot. That's not enough. The question really ought to be, am I going to continue to murmur and complain? And that's when it gets very, very personal. That's when you really want to, close your Bible and go do something else for a little while, because it gets way too personal. Brandon?
I think that, thank you, Elder Eddie. Excellent advice, right? Because it's kind of throwing yourself under the bus, too.
Yeah.
Right? Because unlike Moses, you're not a God ordained,
Right.
chosen, but you're another man like any of us, and fallible is the same, right? So when we do pray to the Lord about our complaints, that is supposed to turn into action.
Right.
Right, and I think that's one of the other big differences of a complainer and someone who's not is their complaint isn't only words, it turns into work.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I complain, is because I don't want to do the work necessary to get whatever I want done.
Right.
And that's why I whine about it. So even in regards to leadership, it's like, well, then do something about it. God has put forth a method of us building each other up and, edifying one another. So get to work.
Right. Exactly. Jerry?
Yeah, I was just going to also say that, no, we're just not complaining, but if there is an issue you have, the Bible tells us how to deal with those also. So you don't need to talk to other people, you can go to the eldership directly.
Right.
The Bible does teach us how to deal with those issues appropriately. We go one-on-one here, because as you're saying, they're men too. Our men are fallible, and we make some mistakes. Sometimes we hear things in display matters and so forth, especially in a large congregation. The thing to do is talk directly to leadership, not all around everywhere else. There's a proper way to handle it.
Godly complaining is this way. You go to the leadership, you voice your complaint, you don't get the answer that you get the answer that you want. You have no reason to murmur. You have no reason to complain. It was heard. What is not understood, and this is what godly complaining is about this. Godly complaining is about submission. I don't like what my mom put on my plate, but I know I have to eat it if I want anything to eat. And that's how it is in the church. That's why it tells you to obey, to submit, and not make it difficult. Because there's things that those who are in those positions know that you just don't know. And God is in that ultimate position. Let me get Cal, and then I'm going to have to get this next point, probably next week.
I was just looking at Numbers 12, and at the end there, verse 8, why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just kind of a real clear warning to us, whether it's a political leader God has put into place,
Yep.
or an elder God has put into place, or and that's real scary.
It is very scary. And the thing about it is, too, and that's why God put in elderships, not an elder, right? Because whatever decision is made, I have to submit to that. As one of the elders, if Charlie and Craig decide differently than me, you know what I have to do? I have to submit. I have to obey. Because it's an eldership's decision, not an elder. That's why the infallible thing, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about complaining. And you're complaining against how God has established things. And so this is some of the things I want you to think about as we close. And I'll hit these very quickly. This is the knowledge thing that I was talking about. Isaiah 29:24. These also who erred in spirit will come to understanding, and those who complain will learn doctrine. This is what we're talking about, because when a person is complaining, they have no delight in understanding. A fool has no delight in understanding, only in expressing their heart. They don't want the understanding, their perspective. And so Colossians tells us in chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, that if we have a complaint against one another, what are we supposed to do? Forgive. And you move on. That's it. There is no biblical right, none whatsoever, to engage in ungodly murmuring, grumbling, or complaining. There's no right whatsoever. And everything, every situation you encounter can be done without grumbling, murmuring, or arguing. And if that's not the way we're handling it wrong. That's why this is such a scary lesson to me. Okay, that's it for this week. Next week, maybe we'll hit something happy, but I doubt it. Appreciate it.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone out this evening for midweek Bible study. It's time to continue. So for those, if you'd like to mark the song after the invitation this evening, it'll be number 315, Oh, Why Not Tonight? And before the invitation, we'll be singing number 56, All Creatures of Our God and King. All creatures of our God and King, lift up your voice and with us sing. Alleluia, alleluia. Thou burning sun with golden beam, thou silver moon with softer gleam. Oh, praise Him, oh, praise Him. Good evening. When you think of people in the Bible with hardened hearts, you probably think of the Pharisees, or maybe Pharaoh, or maybe the Philistines, or I'm trying to think of any other names that start with PH in the Bible, but that's all I got. You would think of them for good reason. However, you may not think of the apostles and Jesus' closest disciples as having hard hearts. A couple of Sundays ago, in Eddie's lesson, he brought up a passage in Mark 6. Mark 6, if you'd like to turn there. And it was after Jesus had fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. After that, he sent the 12 across the sea in a boat. And then Jesus came walking on the water to them. And it says in Mark 6, starting in verse 51, it says, Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. It also says it in Mark 8. Mark 8, starting in verse 14, if you'd like to turn there. Mark 8 in verse 14 says, And the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and did not have more than 1 loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet comprehend or understand? Do you still have hard hearts? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up? They said to him, 12. When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, do you not yet understand? And then lastly, it says it in Mark 16. Mark 16, starting in verse 12. This is after Jesus had arose from the dead. Mark 16 and starting in 12, it says, now after that, he appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking along on the way to the country. And they went away and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, he appeared to the 11 disciples themselves as they were reclined at the table, and he reprimanded them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen from the dead. So these disciples of Jesus sometimes had hard hearts, right? These were the ones who had left their jobs and their families and had followed him around the hill country to help him and serve him, often confronted with aggressive crowds and troubles and hardships, and they often had nowhere to rest their heads at night. How could this be that they had hard hearts? If they could have hard hearts, then you and I could also. Even if we're here tonight and are following and serving Christ in many ways, maybe you're helping orphans and widows. Maybe you're bringing food to people. Maybe you're giving invitations or teaching class or leading songs. No offense, Patrick. You could have a hard heart. But these passages, they give us some symptoms to watch out for in ourselves, to know if our hearts are hard. So let's look at 3 of them tonight. The first one, back in Mark 6, are you astonished by something God can do that you shouldn't be astonished by? And here, I don't think it means amazed. I think it means surprise, right, in this passage. It means doubting and utterly surprised when it occurs, right? Because that sounds off to say. Because, of course, what God can do is astonishing, and we should be grateful for his mercies. But by this point in Mark 6, Jesus had already done many miracles and healings, right? He's healed people, he's cured blindness, he's cured deafness, he's cast out demons, and he's even raised people from the dead. But walking on the water was astonishing to them. Right, it says in the passage, then he got into the boat with them. This is Mark 6, verse 51. He got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So is there something that you're astonished by that you shouldn't be by now? For example, kind of a modern example that I've heard happen before is sometimes people think that they're too lost. They're too lost to be saved. People might think that God would not really love them, would not really forgive them, that they're too bad. And when people say that, it may sound humble, but it's really not. Bluntly, as Mark says here in this passage, if you're saying this, you really have not gained insight through his word. If you can read Scripture and fail to see how God's character and his being is full of love for you, you have not gained insight. And you're really doubting his power, just like the apostles were. Paul, he could have wallowed in his history, but he didn't, because Paul knew whom he had believed in. The second point, Are you missing some lessons that you should have learned by now? The apostles were seeing these miracles, but still missed basic truths of Jesus' power. All of Mark's accounts that we discussed tonight reference how they were missing some lessons that they should have known. How often do we read and never reach a conclusion on something? 2 Timothy 3 verse 7 says about people in error that they are always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. I would submit that that is a hard heart. And the last point, number 3, are you distracted by the cares of the world? In Mark 8, the apostles are worried that they don't have any bread. Again, they are with Jesus who had done all these miracles, yet they are worried about the bread. Jesus showed them how ridiculous this was. He reminds them that he fed 5,000 from 5 loaves and fed 4,000 from 7 loaves. And in Luke 12:6, it says, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 copper coins? And not one of them is forgotten before God? But the very hairs on your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows." As Jesus asked the apostles, do you not understand? One of the concluding points of the Gospel of Mark is in chapter 16, verse 16. And it says, "The one who has believed and has been baptized will be saved, but the one who has not believed will be condemned." Tonight, maybe you realize that you have had a hard heart, but now you do believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the Creator, and the ruler of all things, and that you need to be buried with him in baptism and raised to walk in newness of life, a life devoted to him. Maybe you have done that and your heart is hardened over time, and you are no longer thinking, speaking, or acting like a disciple should. It happened to the apostles, and they were walking with Jesus, and it still happened to them. But they softened their hearts, and God used them. God can change your heart and use you too. If we can assist you in any of these areas, won't you come forward as we stand and sing?
Please be seated for a word of closing prayer, followed by some announcements.
Let us pray. Dear Father, thank you so much for your amazing creation and all the various blessings that you have given us, too many to count. When things don't go our way, help us to remember that our way is not your way, for you are higher than us. Please help us to trust in you and to lament to you and rely on your help. Please help us to remember that you always keep your promises. Help us to receive those promises into our hearts and not be hard-hearted, but seek after you eagerly. As we go out throughout the rest of this week, we've been refreshed by the encouragement of our brothers and sisters. Help us to remember that every morning your mercies are renewed. Thank you so much for your Son. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, good evening to everyone here and all of our visitors. If you are visiting with us, we'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. And if you have a moment after services, please stick around and let us get a chance to meet you. We have just a few announcements before we're actually dismissed with our memory verse, and we'll go over those announcements here real quick. Lisa Smith mentioned to me tonight that on May 19th, she'll be having surgery on a degenerative disc that is in her neck. So let's be keeping Lisa and the Smith family in our prayers that all goes well and it resolves the difficulty that she's been having with that pain. Ben Johnson texted me tonight and said that they're out with some allergies, so they hope to be joining us again Sunday morning. So let's be thinking of them. The Putterbahs are out this evening, and Luke will be having an MRI this Friday, so I know they're a little anxious for that. So let's go and keep them, of course, in our prayers while that is being done, and then, of course, while they're waiting for the results as well. And then let's keep in mind Tim Short as well, who was recently diagnosed with Reiter's disease, which is a type of arthritis which is causing him some discomfort and making it difficult for him to walk. So let's be remembering them. The teen study will be this Saturday, the 8th at 6 here at the building. So if you're a teen, make sure to be planning on attending that. And Angel will be the one presenting that lesson, so I'm sure they're looking forward to that. Any other announcements I may have overlooked? Aaron?
Don't forget about Amy Turner's family.
Yes, thank you. Amy Turner was recently announced that her mother had passed away unexpectedly, so let's be keeping the Turners in our prayers at this time. Thank you very much for reminding me of that.
One more thing. And Kayla and Trey are
Yes.
very important in that, right? And they have that meeting tomorrow with the adopting family, or the family they're adopting from.
Great. Yeah, let's keep Trey and Kayla in our prayers, that they have safe travels and that their meeting goes well. And we'll look forward to having them returning back to us here shortly. I think they'll be getting back tomorrow night, so we'll be looking forward to that. Anything else? All right, well, if not, we'll be dismissed with our memory verse, 1 Timothy 6:6. Now, godliness with contentment is great gain. Let's shake hands and be friendly.